Hi everyone, the purpose of today's video is to talk you through some strategies that you can use to craft an effective introduction. And these types of strategies can be used for any type of paper. In fact, I've sort of made this lesson based on patterns that I've noticed in effective introductions for any type of writing. They generally tend to fall within at least one of these types of strategies. So here we go. First of all, let's talk about what a good introduction should do. And this information is meant just to supplement, it won't replace, but it'll supplement the readings in your textbook about introduction. So please make sure you've completed those readings as well. So a good introduction, first of all, should engage the reader in the scene or the issue that the rest of your paper should be discussing. You may have heard this called a hook. I like to say an engager because you want them to be, anything can catch the reader's attention. But what you want to do is engage them in the scene or the issue. So you want to sort of introduce them to the idea that this issue exists. And there's a couple different ways that you can do that. One main job of the introduction is to provide context or background information for the reader. So anything that the reader would need to know before they get into the nitty-gritty of your actual argument. So any background information that would be relevant and necessary before your main points. And of course, the job of the introduction is also to present your thesis, and your thesis will be towards the end of your intro and often the very last sentence of your intro, because the intro provides that context and that engagement, then your thesis, and then the rest of the paper comes in to support your thesis. So I'm going to talk you through 3 different types of introductions. And again, this is just based on patterns that I have noticed. And so we're going to talk about practical introductions, philosophical introductions, and poetic introductions, which most introductions fall. In fact, every introduction I've seen in any type of writing or even introductions to movies fall within one of these 3. So the next time you sit down to watch a movie, think about the first scene you see. Is it practical, philosophical, or poetic? So practical introductions first of all. So like the name implies, they're going to provide necessary background or contextual information as their main job. So if you're discussing something that has a long history behind it, if you're discussing some sort of current event, you may need to provide background or contextual information. If it's a personal essay and you're talking about, for example, what it's like to be a woman in the military, you may want to spend some time in the introduction talking about, when you joined the military, how you decided to do that, where your basic training was located. So some of that important contextual or background information. So history of an issue, the causes or roots of a problem, or providing statistics or other facts, sometimes to demonstrate that an issue exists. So for example, if you're writing about, animal abuse and why we should have stricter laws about it, your introduction could provide some statistics on how prevalent animal abuse is, or like what the pre-existing laws are. So statistics or other facts to provide some necessary background information. If you've ever seen any of the Star Wars movies, you'll see what we call this the crawl, the opening crawl, and these words sort of just scroll across the screen at the beginning of every Star Wars movie, of course with that iconic music behind it. And this is a great example of a practical introduction because it just provides important information. And without this information, the next scene, which is often like a war scene in the middle of space or something, like it wouldn't make as much sense. So this intro provides the practical information that you need to understand who's who, what's going on in this world, who the bad guys are, who the good guys are, that contextual info. Philosophical introductions are next, and they can be really tricky to pull off well, but they can often, depending on the type of paper, be really effective. So a philosophical introduction explores an essential concept or, value that's going to be important to the rest of your paper. So for example, if you're writing a paper on a particular inequity in education in America, you may want your introduction to make some claims about what is the value of education. So, and then that argument that education is valuable makes the rest of the paper have a greater sense of weight and importance and urgency. So you can begin with a thought-provoking original statement, but you want to be really careful to avoid something very cliched or something really general. So you don't want to do, like since the beginning of time, or statements like a dog is a man's best friend, or something like everybody loves ice cream, something very general like that. Instead, you want to get more original. So if it's something that everybody has said or a statement that could apply to lots of different things, it's going to be too general to work well. You also want to avoid unoriginal questions. So generally, I'm not a fan of questions as the first sentence. They can be done well, but it's really difficult. So this is one that's not actually thought-provoking. Can you think of a time a dog was important to you? Or asking your audience to imagine something is often not very effective. So avoid sort of those overly general or cliched types of beginnings. Here's an example of a philosophical intro from an NPR article called "The Bun Also Rises: Why We Love the Great British Baking Show." And it's a really good example because it's surprising, it's interesting, and it's something we don't hear said before. And that's what makes it effective. So the first lines of this article go like this. We have to posit first that baking itself can feel like magic. So that's sort of a surprising, intriguing, philosophical type of question. A simple loaf of bread might include only flour, water, yeast, and salt, and it can still transform from a sticky blob to a pillowy ball with a texture unlike anything you've ever handled, to a final product, etc., etc. Then there's this next piece of the intro here. Let's posit, too, that American popular culture tends to both idealize and stereotype British people as more genteeled, refined, intellectual, snobbish, artsy, and mannered and tasteful. So we really have like a double philosophical intro because there's two interesting claims going on here, leading to the thesis, which is why Americans like this, Americans like the show because it seems so tasteful to us. And it's about baking, where British people bake things, right? So it leads into the thesis, and these two concepts will be really important and add weight to the rest of the article. Okay, so that's the philosophical intro. The third one is poetic introductions, and maybe the most effective for lots of different types of papers, and also maybe especially personal types of papers. Poetic intros can be really effective for personal papers, and they're also one of the more common types of introductions. So you'll see a lot of types of poetic intros. If there's ever a movie that begins just in the middle of action, that's a poetic intro, because a poetic intro brings an issue to life with a scene or a story. So it sort of just immediately immerses us in a world or with a person and what's going on, or with a character. So sort of just jumps right in with a specific example that comes to life, a personal story, a particular news story, or some other type of vivid description. So you're going to begin with a really vivid anecdote or example, and then you'll come in and do a little bit more practical work by providing an explanation of what it is you're talking about and some context after you just sort of dive in to the poetic intro. If you are doing this, make sure you avoid forcing your reader to picture something by using the words like imagine this type of world or something like that. Because if you've done a good enough job describing it in the first place, they will imagine it. So instead, you can just describe a scene without telling them to imagine it. Sort of becomes an intro cliche to say imagine at the beginning. Here's an example. Again, this one is from NPR. It's an article about how schools are using hydroponic gardens to grow food. So this is the first line from that article. After a full day of school a few weeks ago, 12-year-old Rose Quigley donned gloves and quickly picked bunches of fresh lettuce, Swiss chard, kale, mint, and oregano. But she didn't have to leave her school in Brooklyn, New York, or even go outdoors to do it. So it begins very specific and very vivid because we have a person with a name. She's donning gloves and quickly picking bunches of lettuce. So we've got some good verbs and adverbs going on here. We have very specific nouns: lettuce, chard, kale, mint, and oregano. So it's vivid because it's specific, and that's what makes it effective, because you're immediately picturing that. You're picturing a specific example of a specific person who is participating in this thing the article is talking about. And then after that, notice, then we provide a little bit of context. So she goes to this school, she's participating in this program. Here's what hydroponic growing looks like. So here it becomes more practical, but in the very beginning, it's just a few sentences that paint that picture for the reader and just get them in there. So this might work really well for you depending on, the type of essay that you're writing. So just to review what a good introduction should do, you're going to engage the reader in some way, and the hook can be practical, it can be philosophical, it can be poetic. Also provide some context or background info for the reader. That can be part of the engager, or it can be added after the engager. And then you're going to transition into your thesis so that then your thesis transitions you into the rest of your argument. So at this point, it's time for you to start thinking about what your introduction for your paper should look like, and probably get to drafting one while this is fresh in your mind. Have a good one.